Thank you. Thank you. What would you like to know now? This is the thing.
When were you born?
I was born on the 26th of the 1st, 1925, which was the old, what was it, Australia Day? It's now, no, it was Anniversary Day. Now, it's altered now, and it is Australia Day now. So that makes me 77 in about 3 months. I had nothing to do with when I was born. That was nothing to do with me at all.
Okay.
I went to All Saints there for about 8 years, out at All Saints. I didn't leave there until about the middle of the war. That was 1942, and I went straight into the Air Force then after that. If you go into the Air Force, you do about 8 weeks at an ITS. That's initial what training school, I think it was. You're there for about 8 weeks and you do all sorts of odds and ends, you know, all that sort of stuff. Then they decide as to what branch of the Air Force you will go into. Now, I went in as a wireless and radar operator and an air gunners. Others went in as navigators and then others as pilots, you know, all this sort of stuff. It all depended a lot on what they needed at the time as to where you went. You know, how many losses there were, how many air gunners they wanted, how many wireless radar, you know, and all that. After doing that for about 8 weeks, we were lined up and we were given needles in both arms, and they weren't needles in those days, they were little crowbars. They were, you know, little things nearly as thick as that. And we used to line up, and as you got nearer, you'd get nervouser and nervouser. And all the big strong blokes that used to do all the talking, you know, there's a like that, when they got closer, they got quieter and quieter and quieter, and just before the needles went in, half of them out like a light. And this used to happen. So they used to wake them up and then give them the needles. They wouldn't give it to them while they were down. Anyway, after that, we used to head off for about a week's leave, and then we had to go on to our other camps where we had to do about 6 months fairly hard training. Now, I did wireless there. After that, we then did about another month on the gunnery. After that, we were given our little wings. You know, that the aircrew ones all had the little wings. That took roughly about 9 months. Well, after that, I had about a month then hanging around here. And when our lot was all ready to go to England, that was about January, I think, 1944, all the lot that I was with went, and I was in hospital because I had meningitis, and I just missed out on the draft, and I wanted to go and all that, but the old MO said, no, you are not going, definitely not going, you're going off on leave. So I was about a month later, and I'd lost all my friends, everything else. Now, there is an interesting thing here. I don't know whether you would be interested in it, but Albert Ems out at All Saints, I don't know whether you knew Albert Ems. He was the bursar there. He was the All Saints. He'd been there for years and years and years. Well, when I was at All Saints, he was a school teacher. And he went into the Air Force early on, but he was about 32, and they don't like aircrew at that age. They like the aircrews in the low 20s, you know, for various reasons, which I might be able to tell you later. Anyway, he went into the Air Force, and they asked him to wait until there was a vacancy for aircrew. So he was a driver. Anyway, in the end, I got my wings, and I went to Bradfield, and I was ill. All my mates were gone. And then one day there was a bus arrived, and all the new ones, and I'm standing there like this looking at all the drongos, you know, all the new ones, and Albert Ems stepped off the bus. He was about 2 months behind me. And I suppose I went up to him and said, how are you, sir, even though I was senior to him. I don't know. Anyway, he said, good day, Joe, and I don't know where he ever got the Joe from. But after that, we stayed together then, strangely enough, right through the whole lot, you know, and ended up together and headed home together. Now, he was half a generation older than any of us, but he was an amazing man, Albert Eames. That's a bit incidental anyway. Anyway, about early March 1944, we went up to Brisbane, and we had to board a ship about 11:30 at night, and it was one of those ones that were built in America. They were all steel and all welded. There was no wood on them at all. Everything on them was steel, and it was all welded. And it was empty, and it was heading home empty. Its screw was out of the water by about this much, which meant that it shook like that. The whole way for 16 days it went like this, you know, on this thing, all metal. And we had the bunks down in the hull, and they were 5 high. It was a bunk, sort of, you know, it was an iron one and then held off a chain, you see, and you sort of hopped in there. They were that close together that if I rolled over, I had to lift the bloke above me, you know. We had about that much space. But it wasn't a very nice trip because we had to line up for meals right along the keel, and you get all the oil and the smell of the electric motors and all this sort of thing, you see. And then as you get to the end of the queue, you go round a partition, and here was a big black Negro stripped to the waist, stirring the soup, and the sweat was falling off him faster than he was bailing out the soup. So I lived on hard-boiled eggs and oranges, I think, all the way over. But, you know, it was a bit of fun, but it wasn't very nice, that part of it. Then we landed at San Francisco, and we had a night's leave there, you know, which was a great experience. And then we went right across America by train. So that took about 6 days, I think. And we were lucky enough to get 3 days leave at New York, and that was a great experience there. It really was, you know. It was all new to us. You know, everything over there, you see, was about 20 years ahead of us here then. Over the years, it's evened up a little bit, but they were well advanced then. We were very lucky there to meet another Aussie who was on the Queen Elizabeth. Now, that was the largest boat ever then. Still is. There's never been anyone, you know, any bigger, only aircraft carriers and those things. And he took us all over New York, and he said to us, I might see you Thursday. If you do, look me up. Now, when we were going up the gangplank onto the Elizabeth, he was waiting, and he said, come with me, grab these 2 bunks, and I have to go. His cabin was 8 steps down there. 8 steps only, so we were right beside him, and he was a member, you know, of the... And on board there were 16,000 troops on the one ship. That's 16,000, nearly all Americans. They had other trips afterwards up to 18,000. Now, all the Americans, half of them, they didn't have a bunk each. They used to have 8 hours in, you know, and then they had to get out. But 18,000 on the one after us there were. But we had a great time there because every evening we used to go down into Sid's room, and we used to have beer and sandwiches where all the other poor troops had absolutely nothing. We went all over the ship. We had a look at the engine room. He took us up in the crow's nest, you know. And that's interesting. It starts off inside the mast, which would be about half as big as this room, you know, actually at the bottom, and you climb a ladder, mind you. And he said, whatever you do, don't look down, just climb. So you do, and you climb for a while, and then you look out, and you're level with the top deck, level with the boat deck. You've got all that other bit to go. But up there, this great boat doing about 35, I think, knots, which is about 45 mile an hour or something, ploughing through the waves, 83,000 tonnes of it, ploughing into waves, shooting them out like that. You know, it was a real experience that I will never forget that. You know, it was amazing, really.
Just would have been going as fast as possible to go.
Just about, yes.
The longer you were at sea, the
because
greater danger.
It's unescorted, you see, and then it relied on its speed. Because, but the other thing on board, it was a battleship in its own right, because all up in the top they had 400 Royal Naval gunners just to man the guns. Now this was on the Elizabeth, so it was well armed itself actually. I got all this information off Sid, you see. Anyway, we were on that for about 6 days, I think, and we were heading into Scotland. We were to land, I think it was, what's the port up there? I've just forgotten the name. Gourock, I think, up in Scotland. And we were to land about 6 hours later, and I was having a meal, you see. And next thing I thought, that's funny, you know, it was beginning to tip like this, and next thing plates began to slide down and this sort of stuff and all that. We didn't know what the hell had happened, you see. So straight down, you know, asked Sid. Oh, he said, you know, we've had a scare of the subs up the front. So he said he's just turned it round and we're heading north for 3 hours. And that's what he did. He just sort of turned it, you see, and over it went. And I think to turn it at that speed took something like 8 miles, you know, round, because it was such an enormous ship.
The submarines were the great threat.
Yes, but I don't know whether they would have ever got it. But anyway, I was glad that he went round and came in a bit later.
So the speed of the ship alone was the protection the ship had. The submarines were very slow.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. And the armament also. You know, it had a lot of armament, but it relied mainly on its speed. It was very fast, but I mean, had they got it, you could imagine 16,000 on board, and nearly all Americans. Anyway, I arrived over in England then, and we went down to Brighton. It was a holding unit, you know, a lovely holiday area. It wasn't a holiday area then, but it used to be.
When was this?
We landed in England in April 44.
So it's still just before D-Day?
Yes, yeah. April, I haven't got the actual date, but it was early April anyway, I know. And then we were listening to the radio that night, and we happened to get on to Lord Hawhill. Have you heard of him?
Yes.
I am sorry to report that another 300 Australians have safely arrived at Brighton this afternoon. And that is fact. Isn't that amazing? And we'd only been there a few hours, and he was in Germany. But there were spies all over Brighton, you know, it's amazing. Well, after that, I went for a month up to Whitley Bay. That was a sort of a half commando thing, you know. But the whole trouble was now they had that many aircrew in England, thousands and thousands of them, and a lot of them weren't needed. They had well overcated, luckily. Anyway, we went there, and then what happened? We went on to another radio school, I think, you know, and then we went back to Brighton and then on to another radio school. And then one day we were on our afternoon parade, and there were, I don't know how many there would have been at Brighton, you know, 800 or 900 anyway. And we had this big parade. Next thing we hear, Emson Crossing. And we thought, who? Emson Crossing. Yes, sir, what do you want? Commanding officer wants you to. And we thought, you know, what's going on, you know? So we went into the adjutants and all that, you know, up and anyway into the office and marched in. Yes, sir. Emson Crossing? I said, yes, sir. He didn't even look up, you know. 2 here to go into Coastal Command. Are you 2 interested? And Albert said, oh, sir, look, you know, we've never even considered that. You know, is it all right if we have No, he says, you can't. He says, there's 800 blokes dying to get out of this place. You'll tell me now. So we said, right, we'll go. So then, if you go into Coastal Command, you had to do a lot more radio, a lot more radar, because you were dealing with the Navy. Now, all their Morse code and all that was a lot faster than the Army used or the rest of the Air Force used. So
we should just explain to the girls.
Oh.
The Air Force was divided into a number of commands. You had Fighter Command, built fighter planes.
That's
Bomber
right.
Command, they flew over Germany and dropped bombs. Coastal Command was
out to sea, after submarines and
ships,
all that sort of thing.
keeping an eye out, trying to blow up submarines and trying to protect Allied shipping. So that's what Coastal Command would have done.
That's right. So we had to go to this other school, and we were there for 8 weeks, where we had to do a lot of extra Morse, you know, all that sort of stuff. And then we went to another little holding unit. And then we went up to an OTU, that's an operational training unit. This is where you actually organise yourself into crews, you know. And how that's done, they had 8 crews there, I think, at the time, and they just send a number, you know, that's needed for each one, and then they leave it to you to work out who you go with, you see. Otherwise, if they allocate you, you mightn't like your pilots, you know, this sort of stuff.
When you say crew, that is the crew of one plane?
Yes.
Which was how many people?
At the OTU it was 10, at the squadron it was 12. We were there at the end of 1945. I was a bit younger one, you see. And it was at Allness, which is just about as far north as you can go in Scotland. And it was in the middle of winter, and the coldest winter they'd had for 5 years. Trains were stopped with the snow, and here was some of us Aussies who'd never seen snow in our lives, and we nearly froze up there. You know, it was very cold. But I might tell you what we didn't realise at the time at OTUs. We didn't realise actually in the Air Force at all.
Mrs. Bukta, if you're in the college, could you call the office, please, Mrs. Bukta?
You know, we didn't realise what the actual dangers were, you know, even flying. And I can go into that later if you like, because I have, you know, all these statistics that I have read. But while we were at the OTU for 3 months, we had 4 crashes. And out of the 80 people there, we lost 20. Now, this was a quarter just in accidents. But you see, this is why they want aircrew down in the low 20s, like the young drivers today. It won't happen to me, you know, I can do this. If I went in now, I wouldn't even go up in the planes if we went in then, because there was hardly any maintenance on them. Inexperienced pilots, you know, and they were larrikins, you know, wild sort of blokes. And I never realised this until well after the war. Anyway, after that, I was allocated to 10 Squadron, which was the original old one that ever went to England. That was one of the oldest ones here. And it was all Sunderlands. Now, they were those great big old boats, you know. It was a 4-engine flying boat. And we used to go out over the ocean on patrols, anti-submarines. But see, I was only there about 3 months until the end of the war, because I was one of the younger ones. Now, out of the 300 that we all went over with, as far as I can make out, Albert Ems and I were the only 2 that ever got to a squadron at all. You know, all the others were in holding units. They had Australians, all the nations, plenty of air crew, more or less trained, and they didn't need them, luckily. And they were everywhere. And all those that went over about 1944, not many of them ever got into action at all, actually. So I was a bit lucky or unlucky. I was a bit lucky because it was right at the end of the war and it was pretty safe then anyway. But
because by that time the Germans were desperately short.
Oh yes,
almost everything manned, equipment.
Yeah, that's right. Well, see, it ended in May over there. Well, then after that, I'm afraid we sort of were very nearly on leave then until we came home, and we left over there about the middle of November. We came home on the Aquitania. Now, there's an interesting one there. The Aquitania was a troop ship in the First War. And in the Second War, at that time, it was still the third largest vessel afloat, because the other big ones, there's the Ile de France and there's the Bremen and there were half a dozen others, they were all sunk, and the Aquitania was still, one of the big ones. There were about 3,000 of us on the Aquitania, and it was the last over to England and they were the last back, so it was really the end of all of us in England. All that were left all came home on the Aquitania.
So how long after May of 45, how long after the war finished in Europe did you actually get back?
We didn't leave there till about the middle of November, so we had lots of time.
By which stage the Pacific War was over as well?
Yes, yes, after that. Anyway, on the way back, we were supposed to get leave when we anchored at Cape Town, but when we arrived there, they anchored out in the harbour and it was no leave. And we thought, well, we want leave. So they had to refuel it out there. So we just cut all the rope ladders and we went down the rope ladders onto the refuelers until they were about this far out of the water. And they made for shore. And I think practically everyone on board went ashore at Cape Town. And they used to go around then saying the Aquitania will leave at 10 o'clock in the morning, all troops must be back, etc. And as far as I know, they all got back, all got back. And we were all AWL, but how could they handle 2,500 when the war was over? So that was it. And then I got back to Sydney, I think that took about a month on that one. And we arrived home in through the Heads about 8 o'clock in the morning, and we anchored at Woolloomooloo number 7, and they'd asked all, anyone to meet us there, and you should have seen the crowd there. It was an amazing time actually, and all coming off. So that was about my Air Force history, not very interesting, and it's only half as interesting as those that were on the bombers over Germany, and I was rather lucky that I wasn't in that.
Well, you were going to talk about the loss rates.
About statistics, yes. Aircrew statistics, aircrew had 1 in every 2.8 was a casualty. Now these are to the aircrew ones that had their wings. Now that would have been to the ones that joined up till about the end of 1944, and not long until the war. All those after that aren't in the figures. 1 in every 2.8, was a casualty. Now, that means they would have to be either killed or they would have to be wounded so that it ends their Air Force career. If you've heard about them over Europe, you'll hear them, arguing that it is a tour. Now, how they used to work out a tour in the bombers was it gave each crew a 50-50 chance of surviving the tour. And that's how they estimated the numbers of flights over. It used to vary. If it was really dangerous, they would reduce it. As it got easier towards the end of the war, they'd lengthen it. But that's how it was worked out. You had a 50% chance of surviving.
So they would have said something like, if you do 20 missions over Germany, the odds are that
half the crews
are going to die in
right.
20 missions.
That's right.
So a tour is 20 missions.
That's exactly how they worked it out.
And after you've done your 20 missions?
Well, then you go off, you'd go off and have a rest. Lots of them then had to go back for another one because they used to ask them to go back because they were already experienced, you see, and a lot of them did. I had a friend up here, he did 3 tours. The second one wasn't quite as long, but he did 75 trips, I think, and his odds of surviving that would be like winning a lottery. Yeah. But the other thing that also is interesting, on statistics of all the aircrew that went in, 1 in every 7 was an accident death. 44% of all the casualties were accidents. Now, That seems very hard to understand, doesn't it? 44% of all the losses were accidents. Not enemy action.
Accidents in training, or
Yeah.
someone dropping a bomb.
Well, now that balances with the OTU, you see, where we lost about 20 out of 80, you know.
Saw the enemy doing that.
No, but you see, we were all young. It wouldn't happen to us, you know. We didn't want that, you know. It was a damn nuisance having to go to the funerals, we thought. But that was the attitude then, you know. So now I've talked a lot. I don't know whether you've been interested in that, but I mean...
picture, which was probably cued you guys into some of the things you now want to ask.
Well, this is the easiest way, you see.
Yeah.
Now you can ask me anything, well, anything you like, you see, that you don't understand or anything else. But that was just my history. Now, I was one of the younger ones. Not many Air Force went over to England after me. They just hung around here, and all my mates that were just a few months younger than me, they didn't get out of Australia at all, because I suppose they weren't needed, you know, this was it. So I was a bit lucky. So I suppose if you look at it really, I had a world tour. You know, I didn't have a lot of danger. Well, if I did, I didn't realise it, and I came home and
It's the best possible story.
I had a reasonable time, but that's all the good parts of it anyway. There were some other nasty bits, but we don't talk too much about them.
Okay, Rach.
Okay. You were a volunteer, weren't you?
All the Air Force are volunteers,
Okay.
all of them.
Because
And all
they
the
were
Navy,
going way north of the equator, obviously.
and all the Navy are volunteers. All the AIF were all volunteers.
At the
Then,
beginning.
yeah, all volunteers in the AIF where they were able to go anywhere. They did have the others that they started to recruit about 1942 in the army only, and they were supposed to not go out of Australia. But they then discovered that they could go as far as, where was it, New Guinea, because it was Australia. Now, a lot of these fellows went up there and they got into action and they fought very, very well too. You know, they were right in it up there. But they weren't supposed to go out of Australia. That was the, what was it, CMF. But the AIF were all overseas, all volunteers. All the Air Force was voluntary and all the Navy were voluntary.
What was the general attitude towards the conscripts?
Yeah, that's always a very tricky one to answer if this might be recorded for history's time. Early on, they weren't regarded, you know, we used to call them chocos because they were forced into it. And our argument was you know, ought to have done it of your own accord. But then this changed later on when they went into action up in the islands, because after that they were all accepted, you know, and they did go very well up there. But early on there was a little bit of ill feeling, you know. But that's one question that was a bit awkward.
Okay, and the general attitude towards the Japanese?
Well, I didn't have anything to do with them, you see. I was over in England and, you know, I didn't even see the Japanese. But so I don't know there. I think there was a lot of animosity after the war, you know, but it's growing out now, I suppose. But I can't answer that one because I wasn't, you know, I didn't have anything to do with the Japanese. We didn't like the Germans much.
Okay, what was the attitude towards them then?
Oh, well, you know, I suppose they were the enemy, but I mean, they were educated people, you know, and I suppose their servicemen were just doing what our servicemen were, you know. I mean, they're only looking after their country. If I'd lived in Germany, I would have been in the German Air Force, you know, it's exactly the same. There was no actual animosity against the individuals at all.
Did you feel any pressure to volunteer to go into the war?
No, I couldn't wait. I wanted to get in early on. I wanted to leave school early, and I wanted to get into the Navy because you can get into the Navy, you know, a year younger. But my old man wouldn't let me. He said, no, you will do your leaving certificate and then you can go into it. Because he was in the First War, you see. There's a lot of it, and he was in the second one as well, but he didn't go overseas because he was too old, but he had another 3.5 years in the army again here, but he didn't get overseas in the...
His father did go overseas in the Great War then?
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
So
In the early one.
Yeah?
Oh, yes, yeah.
So that's your granddad?
My father.
Yeah, your father?
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
And your father was a serviceman in the very first day?
Yes, oh, yes, yeah,
Where did he
yeah.
serve?
Mm. And then he was in it again,
Yeah.
you know, in the other
Where
one.
did he go in the Great War?
Over France.
Yeah.
He went to France. And he went over when he was 17 and 2 months. He added his age on, you know, and they didn't argue much. And his old mother said, if you get into the artillery, I'll leave you there. If you get in the infantry, I'll pull you out. Well, he had uncles and those things, and he was in the artillery, so he stayed, and he went overseas, you know, over to France. He was over there for the last little bit over 2 years, I think, over in France. So it's in the family, you see.
Yeah. His experience didn't turn you off, though?
No, it didn't.
It was
It was the opposite effect, the absolute opposite effect, because, you know, it was in the family, and it never entered my head not to get into the services, never once, you know, even you know, you just don't, because it was in the family, I suppose. But...
I guess there's a number of fathers who went to the Great War wouldn't have wanted their children.
I think most of them would. I think most of them would, because that was their attitude. You know, you have to serve your country and you have to help. And I think most of the fathers that were in the First War, if the son didn't go in the next one, I think he would have been rather ashamed of him. Mm. I think that would be the attitude.
That's okay. Was a strong sense of mateship essential to last through the war?
Oh, yes. Oh, very much so, yes. Oh, yes. There's no doubt about that. You know, in the services, everyone looks after everyone else. Very noticeable, you know. I mean, you have your fights and things, but, you know, underneath it all, everyone has to look after everyone else. You see, Aussies over there years ago, there was a thing here. Australians never let their mates down. They never let their mates down. Well, I've found, over the last 30 years, I'm afraid this is fading out of Australia now. It just doesn't happen now the way that it used to. I find now that a lot of the younger ones, and I don't mean your age, you know, but, you know, a little bit older, they're getting very selfish. They just look after themselves. It's all for themselves. If you ask them to do any honorary work these days, it's very difficult to get them to do it, you know. Whereas years ago, everyone would help. But that's not what you're talking about here anyway. That's got another thing. But
it is something about the culture of those times, isn't it?
Oh, it is, yeah. And after the war, everyone helped everyone all the time, you know.
Were you well taken care of and well fed? Like, were you given good
Oh,
rations?
yes. No worries there at all, you know. We had heaps of clothes, heaps of meals. You know, it wasn't always what you'd get at home, but it was always fairly good, yeah, it was good.
What was the source of entertainment during the war?
Oh, yeah. Well, over in England, you see, over there, most of the nights we were off, and they had movies. That was the main thing. If we had a night off, we'd go to the pictures, and there wasn't much else. It was all movies, and they had a lot of those going. But I mean, I've been... I have an old diary at home, you know, that I read, and it appears to me that most nights, you know, after training, anything else, we'd be at a movie somewhere. That's about all we did. Or into the English pubs, you know, they're very nice. You know, the little English pubs were very nice. And they all had their own atmosphere, and, you know, they were very nice. But the English beer was flat. It wasn't any good. Our fellas... when we got used to the English beer, we came home here and we went into the hotel and had 2 schooners we could hardly walk because we'd been used to their flat beer. That was very noticeable, actually.
Their beer was much weaker.
Oh, much weaker, yeah. And it was served hot too. It wasn't cold. But that's the way they live, you know, that's it.
Were you able to keep contact with home? Send letters?
Yes, we used to send letters home. They might take well over a month to get here, you know, well over a month, others longer. About 1 in every 5 or 6 didn't make it at all, so, you know, we don't know where they went. But they had what they called air letters, and you used to write them, you know, on an ordinary, this size paper. Then they used to photograph them onto a tiny little film, and they'd send thousands of these over on a film. When they arrived here, they would redevelop it and then, you know, reprint them and then mail them off to wherever they had to go. Now, those ones were good because they used to come over on aeroplanes usually, and they were a lot faster and a lot easier to carry, of course. You know, they had a lot of them on these little films, and they were called not air letters, airgraphs, I think they were. Airgraphs, or that's not quite right either. I just can't remember. They used to arrive here about that big, you know, a lot littler than the original. No, they weren't air letters, airgraphs. Anyway, I've forgotten the name of them now. I've forgotten what they're called.
Did you get along with other troops from different countries?
Oh yes, over in England,
Yeah.
very, very well.
Did you tend to stick with Australians?
No, in the Air Force over there, you see, they had a lot of them. Now, most of them were all sort of stirred in together. I mean, you'd have a crew, it might have, it wouldn't have Americans, but it might have English, it might have Australians, it might have New Zealanders or any of the other Empire troops, or even Poles or any of those. There was a real sort of a mixture. Where I went, it was all Australian. That was about the only one over there that was all Australian. The whole squadron was all Australian. And there weren't many of those. There were only about 5, I think, all told, that were all Australian.
How did your officers treat you?
Well, you see, aircrew, it didn't really matter whether you were officers or sergeants. I was a sergeant. When you get your wings, you automatically either become, you know, it's sergeant, or if you get your officer, you know, you go on from there. Now, I think wireless air gunners, they didn't have a lot of officers. Most of the officers were pilots, you know, where they had a lot higher percentage of them. I was interviewed actually, and the old fellow said, "How old are you?" And I said, 18, sir. "Well, you can wait." Now, all the 18-year-olds we never even got looked at. There were about 12, I think, after we had our wings that they were officers, and they were all older fellas, old people, I mean about 21, all of them. What happened in the Air Force, you became a sergeant, and then automatically, after 6 months, you became what's known as a flight sergeant. You know, it got the crown. Another year after that, you were a warrant officer. Now, that was automatic if you behaved yourself. But I mean, in a crew, you see, you could have the head of it. Now, that is the pilot. He could be, you know, well, perhaps a flight sergeant, and he could have officers in the crew. Yet once he gets in the air, he is the boss. So actually officers and the other ranks were virtually all the same. You know, it didn't matter much. You know, we just treated each other the same. The only thing is they ate in the officers' mess and we ate in the sergeants' mess. And all the others ate in the airmen's mess, so that was a bit different. No, you can ask me whatever romantic interest.
Very good.
What, over in England?
Yeah.
Oh, we used to pick up girls, yeah. we used to take them out. But it was a bit different to picking them up these days. I can tell you, we were very careful with what we did and everything in those days. But no, there were heaps of girls over there. There were, heaps of girls in the army over there, Air Force and all those. All the officers were all WAF, which was Women Air Force. So there were hundreds of them. Oh yes, I used to go out with girls over there.
Did you feel
I didn't go out with boys, which is the fashion these days. I never saw any inclination in the Air Force of any homo business at all, and that's true. No it was never discussed, it was never talked about, and I never saw any evidence of it at all.
And this is from thousands and thousands ago.
Yeah, but it's just amazing.
So you felt welcomed by the English people?
Oh yes. And in America on the way over, when we had to leave, we used to go into New York and we'd order a meal, and as we walked out, it's paid for. And we'd say, who did that? The old gentleman over here or the old gentleman there. That didn't happen once, it happened on most occasions, and then you'd go over, have a talk to him. Oh, he said, I got a son out in Australia at the moment, we got to look after you fellas, But gee, they were generous, really were. And I wrote home from there saying how nice it was over there, how clean it was, and how I loved New York. Beautiful, clean, everything was spotless. I went over there again in 1985, and it was the exact opposite. It was filthy, the streets were filthy, it was dangerous to walk out at night. I couldn't believe the difference. And the other mate that I had all the time, I was saying, you wait till you see New York, it's beautiful. Oh, God. It wasn't, it was complete change, awful it was.
In the space of 40 years.
Yeah. Mm.
Did you ever get sick while you were overseas?
Ever what?
Get sick?
Yes, I got sick. I was in hospital once.
What was that
What
for?
Oh, it wasn't a wound. I think I had the mumps, I think. It went through, when we were up at Allness, it sort of went through the whole camp, and I think half the camp got it. So that sort of held us up for about 3 weeks. We were in hospitals. But other than that, no, I wasn't sick. But in the Air Force, I was in it for 2 birthdays, and I was in hospital for both of them. Once with meningitis and once with the mumps. I was a bit young because, I was away for nearly 3 years altogether, and I got out of the Air Force 6 days before I turned 21. We were little kids, but we were grown up little kids. I came back up here to Bathurst, and there were heaps of friends here that hadn't gone, and when I met them then, we had nothing. They were still school kids virtually, and I'd grown up, well, I don't know, 8 or 9 years in the 3 years. Over the years it grew out, but for the first 6 months I thought, I've got nothing in common with them at all.
When you were doing training, did you ever do training for land battle?
No.
No.
Yeah, only once when we landed in England, we went up to Whitley Bay. That was a sort of half commando thing. It was for land stuff, yeah, but that's all I ever did.
What was it like in the hospitals?
Well, the one here, it was a military hospital here. It was exactly like any other hospital. I didn't see any difference, except that I didn't know anything for 3 days at all, but I believe it was all right. The one over in Scotland, when I was there, I was moved up to a small hospital, in a little village. I think it was called Strathpeffer Hospital, and it was just like any other little hospital. So it was a private hospital.
Do you still keep contact with some of your old friends from the war?
Yes, not many of them now. I had an interesting one about 3 years ago. One of our other wireless operators, I was yarning to my son actually, and happened to mention it. He said, "Oh," I said, "I don't know where he lives now," so on the machine, you know, like this. "What's his name?" And I said, "Alan Archbold." Like this. "There's Archbolds here and there's Archbolds there." And I said, "Well, the Archbolds here was about, you know, where he was." So I got a number. When I rang up this fella, it was his brother, you know, so I was onto the right family. Anyway, I rang him then, you know, at his own home, and about a year later he said, "I'm heading up to the Gold Coast," so he came round this way and had a night here with me. Now that was about a year ago. Well, that was well over 40 years, and in between time I hadn't heard anything. You were talking early on about romances. This wasn't a romance at all, but when I was at Beccles, that was waiting to come home. It was a holding unit, and you know, I'd had the leave, so they asked some aircrew to work for a while, you know, in the head office down there, and I said, "I'll do that." Well, there were 3 or 4 WAFs in the office as well, and there was one called Rennie Blackwell, and I knew her well at the time. Anyway, I came home, heard nothing, no letters or anything else. When I went over to England in 1985, I just wrote to the old address and said, "If you know anything of Rennie, I will be at this hotel in London in between this date, you know, and that date," and I didn't think any more of it. Anyway, we were at the hotel. I had to ring off her son. He rang me up. "Mum's in America, unfortunately." And I said, "Well, that is a pity, but however, she'll be home on whatever it was, on the 8th, I think." And I said, "Well, it's the 8th that we're leaving to go back to Australia." So after that, I used to send her, you know, we used to write every now and again. And then about 3 weeks ago, 4 o'clock in the morning, the phone rang, and of course that always scares you, doesn't it? And I answered the phone. Hello, it's Rennie here from England. I just thought I'd give you a ring. I haven't written." Now there you are, after 50 years. And I said, "How'd you get the number?" "Oh, you can get anything on these computers these days." So, you know, so that's one of your romances things, you see. Gee, I got a surprise. 4 o'clock. She said, "I thought it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon." I said, "No, it's not. It's 4 o'clock in the morning." But that didn't matter at all. But so I had a yarn to her. So these things happen. But you see, Air Force weren't like the Army. In the Army, you were in the unit and you stayed in the unit, and you know, you were together for nearly all the time. In the Air Force you weren't. You were moved around all over the place, you know, and you didn't stay with any large number. So.
How did you react when the war was finally over?
I had a beer. We had a few beers, and you know, we were relieved, of course. You know, we handed in all our flying gear and said, "Glad to get rid of the stuff," you know, this sort of stuff. And then we had a, you know, little bit of a celebration in every town. That went on for about 3 nights, you know, all day, all night, you know, with everything, and you know, everything happened. And then when the war ended in Japan, I was in London, and that was a terrific night. You know, it really went wild, and all the lights came on, and you know, it was a great feeling.
Did you ever think the Allies wouldn't win?
No.
You were always confident?
Yeah. You know, I don't think you ever have to think that way. You know, we always thought that we would win, yeah. We never had any doubts. Especially...
Why were you so confident?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if they were early on. You see, I was still at school then. But when I got over there, you know, we reckoned, you know, it was only a matter of time, and we expected it to end earlier, actually. You know, it lasted longer after D-Day than we ever anticipated. But we never got the idea that we'd lose, you know, that just never entered our head at all, you know, never.
What was your greatest mission?
Oh, I don't know. How do you mean?
The one that you feel that you accomplished the most in the RAF.
Greatest achievement, maybe.
Well, yeah. You mean, you know, in the actual learning part of it, or what? Or
The actual war part of
I don't know. That's a bit hard to say. You know, I suppose, you know, when we had to go out looking for one of our aircraft, you know, at Nall Ness, you know, it went out on an exercise and we never heard it, found it, anything else, and we all went out looking for it for 3 days, I think, and we never found a wreckage. And that was amazing because, I mean, they've all got wirelesses, and in a Sunderland you don't just crash, you know, I mean, you can skid along the water. But there was no message ever came in, and we never found a clue. They were all Canadians, actually, that one. And then I didn't have any real sort of bad experiences, you know. Little bits.
What was an average mission like?
Oh, yeah, the average one on Sunderlands, you'd be on patrol for about 12 to 14 hours, you know, out over the ocean.
What was the aim of the patrols?
Looking for submarines. That was 80% of it, you know, or other ships, but I mean, all the ships were ours anyway, so that didn't matter.
Daytime, Daytime or nighttime?
Overlapped, yeah. Mostly 80% of them would be in the daytime, but we used to have to pick them up on radar, you see, you know, and then you were able to. I never actually attacked any submarine. I mean, of all the ones that were there weren't many actually ever attacked a submarine. It'd only be about one crew, you know, in every 8 or 10 that ever really attacked a submarine. So it was, you know, a lot of it was very dull.
But you were armed.
Oh, yes.
Did you actually fight a submarine? That was
Oh,
the
yes,
mission.
yes. We carried 8 depth charges, you know, and they weighed 250 pounds each. But and we were well armed as a Sunderland. We had 15 machine guns on a Sunderland, and we were known as the what was it? Flying. What it was a porcupine. That's what the Germans used to call us, the flying porcupine. 15 machine guns. So they wouldn't ever, you know, ever have a go at you from other fighter planes unless there are half a dozen of them, because one wouldn't have a chance against the Sunderland, not one. They'd have to have at least 3, you know, all angles, and they had to come up underneath because we had nothing underneath, because we had to land on the water, of course. But then, you know, if you get low enough, they can't come underneath, so that was all the thing.
And most of the flying was low, I guess.
Oh yeah, very low. We do our average patrol at about 3,000 feet, not much more than that, you know.
And you had the short wavelength radar that was able to pick up reasonably
Yes,
small objects.
early on they had the one, you know, that had the long aerials. Then they got the ones, you know, that had the round screen. Now it was a better one. It was the AS5, you know, or whatever it was, and it just lit up the whole area. And then if it hit anything, it was a little blip. I've got some other things at home. If you drive up the coast, the outline looks exactly as if it's a map, you know, on the, you know, it's as good as that, or was then. I don't know how it is now. I mean, they were out of date compared to now, but they were very good. Now, the only time I had a little bit of fun was when we were out once, and all of a sudden everything closed in, you know. It was a fog. Now it comes in just like that, and it went right down, right over all the area, and there was no way that we were able to go anywhere else because we didn't have enough fuel, and we had to land on what's known as the radar. Now, I happened to be on the radar at the time, and it used to have a beacon at the end of the landing area, you see, and on the radar you had to keep accurate on the beacon, you had to read out to the pilot if he was, left or right of the beacon and the range. And as you read out the range to the beacon, he knew what height he had to fly. So he just kept bringing it down and down and down until we hit the water.
Even though he can't see?
You couldn't see a thing. He was relying on me giving him the right readings, and all the other crew member, I can imagine them say, "You sure you got the right dial? You sure you got the right thing here?" But, it landed without any trouble at all. It was easy to do.
We're running long time. We've got about 5 minutes to go, guys.
But-
Did you enjoy your overall experience of the war?
Yes, I think so. It's a thing that if I hadn't gone, I would have never forgiven myself. I think that's the number one. And early on, I had a fairly easy time, you see, because I was one of the younger ones. Now, had I been a year older, the odds of me being here would have been about 1 in 3, as I say. But even where I was, you see our hut at Parks, I did my wireless training at Parks, there were 31 in each hut. Well, we lost 6 of those, even then. So, that's about 1 in 4 or 5. And it's on towards the end of the war after things, were reasonably easy. But it was a risky business. But
You obviously don't regret going.
oh, no, I'd go again. Yeah. No, if I hadn't gone, I would have never forgiven myself,
Right.
No, I think that's all the questions I have, really.
Were you ever nervous going into any battles? Or
Oh yeah, I was nervous plenty of times. Yeah, even taking off and landing, you get nervous in those things. But oh no, you get nervous, all right. Yeah, everybody does, But I don't know how I would have handled it. If I'd had to go over in the bombers, I'd have handled it like everyone else did, I suppose. But afterwards, I was rather glad that I wasn't put onto bombers. But if I had, I would have done it. You just seem to have that look, all your mates are doing it, so you do it, If you had to go out on your own, it'd be very difficult. But if you're all going out together, well, you go together, that's it, and you all look after each other.
I was going to say,
No.
just the early years of the war when you were still at school, how did life at school change as a consequence of the war?
Well, it was a boarding school then, you see, and it was a fairly small school. Well, actually, as the war went on, the numbers dropped, right down. And I think the year I left All Saints then, that was 1942, there were only about 150 there. When I started there in 1936, there were about 300 or something. But they were out of money, and all that, and most of them were from the land, and they had to help their fathers, and I think that was the reason. But I wasn't very interested in school. I did join that air training corps. Now, it started in Bathurst in 1941, and I was the second bloke into it here. And it was a lead up to the Air Force, you see. I was a sergeant in that, I think.
And you already knew that it was the Air Force you wanted to go.
Oh yes, that's right, because Dad wouldn't let me leave school and join the Navy, that's why.
And he didn't want you to go into the army?
Oh yeah, he wouldn't have minded, yeah. He wouldn't have minded at all, but having an opportunity to go into the ATC, I was sort of, lining up for the Air Force then, you see, because it was automatic that you go on into the Air Force, and I did.
So you were still at school when Pearl Harbor was attacked
Yes.
and Singapore fell.
Yes.
How did it feel, those weeks, 60 years ago almost now, when
Yeah.
first of all Singapore fell and then Darwin got bombed?
Yeah,
I
well,
don't know how you felt.
I don't know whether I can remember, but at that age group, you weren't really concerned all that much. You'd hear the news, but you had other things on your mind. You played football and you played, all this sort of stuff. And I don't know whether I was really interested in it at all. I mean, you're interested, but, you know, I don't know how worried you were. I don't think I was really worried about anything very much at the time.
Old
Old people. Let the old people fight it out. In action, you got that one. Now that's a 1939 Star. Now that went to most people that were in a war zone. Atlantic Star, that's because I was over the Atlantic Ocean, you see. The ones over Europe, they got an Aircrew Europe if they were prior to D-Day. After D-Day, they got the France and Germany after D-Day. That one is for half a year in a war zone without being actually on a squadron. That is the English War Medal. Now that went to everyone that was in our army or the English army or any of those for about 1 month's service. This was our War Medal out here, and it was issued to us for 18 months service. That has now been altered about 5 years ago, and you now get it for 1 month. That is a national medal that I got because I was in the SES for 28 years, and you know, that earned one. That is an Order of Australia medal that I got about a year ago, you know, for some other work.